when Ashoka sent those two arahants to Burma centuries ago, the prediction was, and Saiji U Ba Khin, Goenkaji's teacher, often used to quote this prediction, that Burma would keep this gem of Dhamma for centuries. 2,500 years after Buddha, it would be returned by Burma to India, and there it would spread round the world. Last time, we talked about Goenkaji's childhood, his early years, his training under Sayagyi, and the establishment of Dhamma in India. Now we find him poised on the next part of his Dhamma journey, ready to start spreading Dhamma around the world. And his first invitation was to France. He was invited by one of his very early students, Tara Miquel, and she was a member of the French Yoga Meditation Federation. Although she was a very early student, she was only a one-course student. And the course was advertised in the Yoga Federation's journal, along with various other yoga retreats. And so most of the people who came were yoga teachers. And they thought they were coming for a rather nice, pleasant holiday. A deluxe hotel had been booked. It was actually a converted French chateau, a French 18th century French castle. And they thought they were coming for a nice time, catch up with their friends, do a bit of yoga, have a few chats, network a bit, and maybe a few hours of meditation thrown in here and there. No one had told them about the noble silence, about the long hours of meditation, cutting off all contact to the outside world. There were a few old students, but they were far outnumbered. So, big reaction, a very bumpy start for Goenkaji's first course outside India. The manager was Bill Hart, and Bill Hart recalls how he'd be going to Goenkaji every day, sometimes more than once a day, saying, "Oh, Goenkaji, they're doing this now, they're doing that now," and Goenkaji was just smiling. He knew Dhamma would spread, he knew the seed was being planted. And one of the questions and answers that comes from that course, which was remembered, an old lady comes to Goenkaji, partway through the course, and, "Oh, Goenkaji, I had such a deep pain, such a strong pain in my heart last sitting. I thought I was going to die." And Goenkaji says, "Has it passed away?" And she says, "Yes." He says, "Good." And she looked totally stupefied. And he said, "Well, would you like it to continue?" So that was the kind of mood he was in. So in spite of all the bumps and difficulties, the seed was sown. Another course in France, and then he goes on to Montreal in Canada. Now he arrived in Montreal to 180 students, many old students from America, from Canada, who'd served with him, sat with him in the early years of India. So a totally different group of students. But he'd arrived in the middle of a searing heat wave in Montreal, and the place that had been booked was a school for small children. It was holiday time, so they weren't there. So all the furniture, everything was for small children, 4-foot-high people. So the water bubblers were 2 foot high, the toilets were about the same height, the tables and chairs were all 3/4 height, and what was worst of all was there was no air conditioning. The hall was a gymnasium, very poorly ventilated, and it was so hot that sometimes people in the back rows were fainting. There was no proper exercise area. The only area they could exercise was the size of a 3-car garage. And not even properly hidden from the street, there was just a chain link fence between the students and the street. They'd walk up and down in silence, and the locals, the neighbors, would hang out on the chain link fence watching them. They felt like monkeys in a cage. And it was a relatively poor area, and the local kids used to like to drive their cars up and down the road, screeching their tires. On one occasion, about day 6 or about day 7, the hall was quiet. They distinctly heard the neighbour opposite walk down the driveway, get into his car, slam the door, rev up the engine, roar down his driveway, and then suddenly there was a squeal of brakes and tyres and a crash as he hits his own metal trash can, which then bounces down the street. The whole hall erupted in laughter. So that was Montreal, but again, Goenkaji was happy. In future, they would know about better organisation. The seeds were sown. He went on to England for 2 courses there, which happily went rather more smoothly. Next year, 1980, again a big tour, Europe, America, and this time Australia. 120 students in Switzerland, again Montreal, again Chicago, same sort of numbers. California, 400 people applied for the course. Only about 200 could be taken, 2/3 new students. And then Sydney, Boy Scouts campsite at Heathcote outside Sydney, 120 students, Perth as well. And again, Goenkaji was very happy to see so many of his old students who'd worked with him in India in the early years, keeping their Shila, keeping their practice. And on this tour, he made a very important decision. He talks about it in the 10-day courses. Up to then, on all these campsite courses, charges had been made for boarding and lodging. Nothing for the teaching, of course, but he felt this was wrong. So when he was in America, even though some other teachers, compatriots of his, had been charging, he decided that from now on, all his courses would be on a dana basis. And of course, there was no money, so how was it going to be done? But he said, if you don't have the money, cancel the courses. An old student, Kate Pratt, now Kate Lapping, donated a large sum of money, which became the seed fund for all those future courses, and so the campsite courses could continue. But the pressure on Goenkaji was now enormous. For us assistant teachers, it's very easy. We just come, we're conducting a course, we sit up there, we press a button, and out comes some instructions or a discourse. But for Goenkaji, everything was live. So early morning, the early morning chanting, live. Group sitting, live. Instructions afterwards, live. And then checking the students, meditating with them. Long interviews at lunchtime, live instructions in the afternoon, and a live discourse every evening. You can just imagine the punishment of that day after day and course after course. And of course, when he came back from his tours outside India, almost continuous courses at Dhammagiri, and Jaipur and Hyderabad were begging for their courses, campsite courses were requested, very little break. And people were saying to him, his old students, look, Goenkaji, you can't continue like this, you've got to do something. And the something he did was that year, at Dhammagiri, he sat his self-course. As usual, many of his old students from outside India came as well to meditate with him. He gave a Satipatthana course afterwards, the first 30-day course. And then he called some of his older students and said, right, now I want you to help me. I want you to start giving courses. And that's the names of the first 8 students he asked. Ram Singh, Dr. Savla, Mr. Parikh, Mr. Ratty, all from India. John Beery from America, Graham Gamby, R. Graham Gamby from Australia, Norm Schmitz from America, Bill Hart from Canada. And of course, it was an experiment. And you'll notice that initially there were no women in this group. And this was not because Goenkaji was in any sense against women. He knew how much he personally relied on Mataji. But because this was a big experiment, he didn't know how it would go. He didn't want to risk offending the traditional meditators in the Theravadian Asian countries. In the long run, of course, it was always planned that women would be there. But the courses proved very successful. Of course, there were some initial bumps. The first course at Bodh Gaya, again given by Bill Hart, there was a double booking. and a group of pilgrims were sleeping in the Dhamma hall for the first 4 days. Bill had his tapes. He'd gone off to Dhamagiri to get his tapes, and he was relying on those. They were a pretty fair mixture in a paper bag. He got through the first day, played the discourse, all that went fine, went to play the post-discourse instructions, and out came a faint hiss from the tape player. So even on that very first course, Bill had to give live instructions, and he had to give them all the way through the course every evening. There were other problems. Central America, a very early course given by Dr. Savla. The local police became suspicious. What's going on at this place? This was in Panama. So they arrived on the site and carted not only Dr. Savla, but all the meditators off to jail to interrogate them. That was the end of that course. So there were a few early bumps. But in general, it was incredibly successful. And today, of course, we can't imagine how Dhamma would spread without assistant teachers. By the end of those first 2 years, there were 30 assistant teachers appointed. Here's a few of the early Western teachers, all looking very happy at Dhamagiri. And by 1984, Goenkaji was appointing women, and many of them, not only the wives of the first assistant teachers, but independently conducting women as well. People like Shanti Ben from India, Vajira Cook from Sri Lanka, Melba Deland from France. And in those first 2 years, something like 100 courses were conducted by assistant teachers. So the program was up and running. And one thing every assistant teacher needs is good recordings. And as so often happens in Dhamma, the right person turns up at the right time. And this was Thomas Christman. Just recently, he passed away after an illustrious career as a teacher. In those days, of course, he wasn't a teacher. He'd just taken his first course with Goenkaji in Chicago. He was so impressed that that winter he went to Dhamagiri. Now, Thomas was a lawyer, a very successful lawyer, a patent attorney in Texas with a flourishing legal practice. He went off to India expecting to meditate and never come back. He told Goenkaji of his plans, and he was rather shocked. Goenkaji said, "No, don't give up your career. Continue as a lawyer. There are many people whose rights are getting trampled on. You need to protect them. And there are many people who would not take Dhamma unless they heard about it from someone, another professional like yourself. You can be a bridge to those people." So Thomas continued his legal career. But one thing he realized was that these assistant teachers, and he was not one at that stage, needed good tapes, good recordings. So he approached Goenkaji and said, "Look, I'd like to record you. I'd like to make proper recordings of all your instructions and discourses." Goenkaji was very hesitant. He thought the students might be disturbed. But Thomas said, "Oh, I'll just be like a little mouse." Goenkaji said, "All right." So a few months later, a course in Mendocino in California, Goenkaji is conducting, and something new is happening. There's Thomas Christman sitting in front of him, headphones on, surrounded by recording equipment. That winter, Thomas went to Dhamagiri to record Goenkaji in English and Hindi, and he arrived with 2 large steamer trucks from Texas, full of equipment, car batteries, recording equipment, lights, the whole lot. And of course, India was much more difficult to record in than America. You got power failures, that's why the batteries were there, or the microphone was in the wrong place, or suddenly there was a storm and Goenkaji was having to shout over the rain. All kinds of problems. But each year, for 6 years, Thomas came back again and again, recording, perfecting, and it was only after the 6th edition that he was happy with what he'd done. And not just the recording, but each year, after having finished his recording, he'd go back with the raw tapes, edit them, index them, and produce boxes of cassette tapes. And his own personal donation was a little briefcase of 42 cassette tapes to cover the 10-day courses for each assistant teacher. All that was done by Thomas. Later on, of course, they were translated into many other different languages as well. And now something else started happening. Centres started arising outside India. And the first was this one, Dhamma in Massachusetts. The old students in that area combed the state, and they found this rambling 2-bedroom house in 8 acres of open meadow. They bought it, and the first course was very small. It was just the house, just 8 students. Goenkaji came in 1982, gave a 2-day course to inaugurate it, and Dr. Savla continued giving courses for about 25 there. Many, many courses. The next year, they invited Goenkaji again, but by this time they'd built a bathhouse and a commercial kitchen. And there was a tennis court there. They put a tent on the tennis court, and so now the course was about 140 students. And so Dhamma took off. A beautiful photo here of Goenkaji giving metta, walking around the center, and of the first sign erected outside the center, VMC, Vipassana Meditation Center. That's Rick Crutcher on the left, who became a teacher himself, and Kate Lapping, the lady who donated that first seed funding for the campsite courses. Now in Australia, in Dhammabhoomi, the approach was a little bit different. That's where we are today. Bare land was bought in the Blue Mountains. No house, nothing. There was a rather rusty old car on the land which had to be towed away. Otherwise there was nothing. And so the race was on to try and build a centre in time for Goenkaji being invited out in November 1983. 4 workers were invited from Dhammagiri. One of them is an assistant teacher here today. And they worked hard through a really bitter winter. They were having to break the ice in the ponds when they came to work in the mornings. And here you see a couple of them laying the foundations for what is now C Block. No electricity, so they had a generator, and all kinds of problems. One particular problem we remember well was setting up a sewage system. It was decided to pump to the main sewage, which was some distance away. But in order to do that, 3-phase electricity was needed. It wasn't there. An appeal to the electricity authority, nothing was happening. 3 weeks before Goenkaji was due to arrive, an official visited from the electricity company, saw all these people working, and he asked who they were, and he was told they're all volunteers. And he was so impressed, he said, okay, I'll fix this for you. 3 weeks later, 3-phase electricity was put down the street, the sewage pump was connected, everything worked. That was the night before Goenkaji arrived. So it was pretty tight timing. And on the right is the first group sitting at Dhammabhoomi. No walls, no roof, it was just the foundations of the buildings at that stage. And it was rather cold, as you can probably tell from the photo. Now that first course in November 1983, that's spring in Australia. But Goenkaji was greeted on his first course by a wild storm and snow. I remember him saying, is this normal weather? And we said, no, Goenkaji, this is not normal weather. But we got through it. The food had to be cooked off-site because there was no kitchen at that stage. And the only dining room was an army tent, which you can see in the foreground. Of course, later, all these other facilities were built. But that was how the first course went. But it was a very smooth course, hardly a question even till day 7. The students just worked. About 70, 80, 90 students on that course. And Goenkaji loved the site. He gave this wonderful quote at the end, that this place would become a lighthouse of Dhamma for centuries. From Dhammabhoomi, Goenkaji returned, as usual, to Dhammagiri for his self-course, and winters at Dhammagiri were now becoming a big occasion. 1981 was his self-course, the first Satipatthana, the first 30-day, and after that he took something like 50 of his old students on a pilgrimage around the sacred places in India. Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, Bodh Gaya, where he got enlightened, Sarnath, where he gave his first discourse, Kushinagar, where he passed away, and various other places. Now, how to get Goenkaji plus 50 people around all these sites? They hired 2 carriages from Indian Railways. One was for Goenkaji and the other 50 students, rather crowded, and the other one was for Mahavir, who was the cook, and he cooked in the second carriage. And the 2 carriages were just hooked up to different trains according to wherever we wanted to go. It worked very well. 1983, again his self-course. Now there were 2 30-day courses, and the pagoda had 250 cells. So things were developing very fast. The next year, 8 more acres of land were purchased around Dhamagiri, something like, and this was to provide a buffer from the town of Igatpuri, which was expanding and not getting any quieter. Something like 5,000 trees were planted on those 8 acres. Fruit trees were planted at Dhamagiri, flowering shrubs. It was becoming a real green haven amidst the rather barren, rocky, desolate hills which you see in the background. And all kinds of new animals, birds, insects were being seen on a regular basis. The next year, a second hall was built. 140 students on a 30-day course, each with their own room and cell. And in the meantime, of course, Goenkaji was continuing his Dhamma tours. And you can see a list of the countries he was visiting year after year. He could no longer visit Australia and America every year. It was just too much. So towards the end of the 80s, he was alternating between the 2. But he visited Sri Lanka, had an important conversation with the monks there. They, of course, knew the scriptures very well, and he was able to show them how sensation, the practice of sensation, was integral to the practice to Buddha's teaching, and they agreed. Nepal, the land where Buddha was born, accepted Dhamma very readily. 30 students on the first course. A couple of years later, something like 800 applications for the courses. Land was donated in the Kathmandu Valley, and that became the great center of Dhamma Shringa, as it is today. Japan was a bit different. There were a few old students there, serious students, mainly Westerners. They wanted a center. They had no money, and land was very expensive there. Nevertheless, they looked, and they found a suitable piece of land, tiny compared to most places, just 2/3 of an acre, but possible, in a good place. And land in Japan was very expensive. Now what to do? An old student comes forward, offers to mortgage his house. So the land is bought. Other students give loans. They decided to import a cedar structure from Oregon in America. The local agent lived 10 minutes down the road, so that was easy. But now how to build it? The meditators there didn't have much skills in that department, but 5 meditators came from New Zealand. And those 5 meditators put up that cedar structure with help at the weekends from the locals, and then they had 70 rooms and a hall for 90, but still no kitchen. And then the local timber yard decided to move and donated its old building. So now they had a kitchen and they had a functioning center. Centers also arose in France and the UK. Pariyatti and Patipatti, 2 Pali words, very important, critical aspects of Dhamma. Patipatti is the practice. That's what we do. Pariyatti is the theoretical study, the study of the theory of Dhamma. And that also is very important, and Goenkaji wanted to emphasize that. Because as he points out, even in his discourses, of course, there is some pariyatti, some theory is involved in order that people can understand what they're practicing. But he says, when you actually go into the words of Buddha, you understand so much more. So he founded the Vipassana Research Institute. It started offering Pali language courses so that people could study Buddha's original words, 1-year courses, Some of the students who took those one-year courses are teachers, assistant teachers today, and their expertise in Pali is incredibly useful to us. But one thing of which Goenkaji was very conscious was that India had completely lost all the words of Buddha, not only the practice, but the words. He talks about when he first came to India, in the Hindi dictionary, he looked up the word vipassana. It didn't exist. Burma had kept it, of course, and in the 50s there was a big council in Burma. Saiji Ubar Khin helped organize that. And that was to purify the words of Buddha. Monks were invited from all the other Asian countries which had retained the words. They went through all the scriptures, all Buddha's discourses, compared notes, make sure that no mistakes had crept in, and then produced a fully authenticated version. That was the Tipitaka, literally the 3 baskets, the full teachings of Buddha in the Burmese edition, the authentic edition. But India had lost it. A few Indians were there, and they went to Nehru, who was then Prime Minister of India, and said, look, India has completely lost all the words of its most famous son, the Buddha. Surely something should be done. Nehru agreed, and he started the Nalanda Institute and charged it with publishing the entire Tipitaka. Scholars, enthusiastic scholars came from all kinds of different places, worked hard on it, but somehow the effort stalled. And although it did produce some work, today you can't get even isolated volumes. So this Vipassana Research Institute, founded by Goenkaji, undertook the monumental task of publishing the entire Tipitaka. Now, just to give you an idea, the words of Buddha come to 15,000 pages, 140 volumes. And not only that, but there are commentaries and sub-commentaries produced by learned monks over the centuries, throwing light on the words of Buddha, another 35,000 pages, that's 50,000 pages in all, to be published. And at Dhammagiri at that time, they had one computer, which served all the needs of the center, and that was their only data entry. So they wrote to the students around the world and said, anyone who's got a computer, please do some data entry for us. We'll give you the software and we'll help. But it was a slow process. And Goenkaji wanted everyone to know about Vipassana. He was giving regular talks in Mumbai, popular talks, and through the Vipassana Research Institute, he started organizing seminars. That 1985 one was in Mumbai. 1,000 people attended, medical professionals, government officials, administrators. Very popular. Of course, Goenkaji gave the keynote speech. The next year, 1986, was a format which would become familiar. A number of papers were given first, and then all the participants were asked to actually sit a 10-day course with Goenkaji. At the end, they met again in groups, full of enthusiasm, and made all kinds of recommendations about how there should be children's courses, more research into Ashoka's writings, and so forth. The 1990 seminar, also at Dhammagiri, a very important one, Vedana and Sampajanyam, that was the key to Buddha's teaching. Vedana means sensation, Sampajanyam means the awareness of anicca, the key elements of Buddha's teaching. And something like 500 monks and other people came, and there was Goenkaji, now armed with whatever research the RI had done, pointing out that this was actually Buddha's teaching. What he was teaching was directly in line with what Buddha had taught. Significantly, there was a group from Burma there, including 5 monks, who went back to Burma and reported. Now, 1990 was a big year for Goenkaji. He came to Dhammabhumi. He gave the Satipatthana course here, which was recorded. That's the recording used today. He also inaugurated the cells here. But on day 5 or 6, something much more important happened. He got a call from the Burmese ambassador in Australia, in Canberra. Now some background. His head after this call was in a whirl. Why? When he left India, you might remember that he could not travel on a Burmese passport because he could not get it endorsed, so he took an Indian passport and travelled on that, and that's what he'd been using ever since. Now, the military government in Burma took a dim view of citizens outside the country changing their nationality. As far as they were concerned, a change of nationality was an act of treachery. And traitors were not permitted back into the country, not even a transit visa. So there was Goenkaji banned from his motherland. And this had been the way for years. And it hurt him. He talked about how often his heartstrings would be tugged as he remembered Burma, remembered his motherland, and pangs of missing Burma, wanting to go back there. But he had another Dhamma reason for wanting to go back. When he taught Vipassana in India and elsewhere, he always said, I am teaching Dhamma. He never used the word Buddhism. He knew that because of long-time prejudice in India against Buddha, against Buddha's teachings, it would just be regarded as something sectarian. People wouldn't come. So he said, this is Dhamma. And also he realized that Buddha himself always used that word Dhamma. In the whole of the Buddhist scriptures, you never see the word Buddhism. Often journalists used to question him. They would say, how many people have you converted to Buddhism? He'd say, none. They'd say, what, aren't you a Buddhist? He said, no, I'm not a Buddhist. And they said, but you're teaching Buddha's teaching. He said, yes, I teach Dhamma. Now these words, of course, were reported back in Burma, and some of the senior monks and others were very hurt. They thought, oh, Goenkaji, this son of Burma, is teaching Buddha's teaching, but he's saying, I'm not a Buddhist. They didn't understand. He wanted to go back to Burma to explain it. But of course he was banned. Now it so happened that a couple of years earlier, Colonel Mong, an old friend of his, who was past president of the military government of Burma, now retired, the very president who had actually denied him his Burmese visa for other countries. Mong was visiting India, visiting his daughter, who was working in the Burmese consulate, the Burmese embassy in Delhi. And his daughter said, well, look, many good words are being said about Goenkaji, about his courses. Why don't we go and visit him? Mong agreed. He was actually a friend of Goenkaji's, a personal friend. Went up to Jaipur, where Goenkaji was. Goenkaji was about to start a course there. And he said, well, why don't you take the course? You've got the time now, you're retired. Mong agreed, took the course, was thrilled. Went back to Burma and told all his cabinet colleagues and everybody he could meet. He said, look, Goenkaji's doing wonderful work in India. He's very respectful about Burma. We should invite him here. And so on day 5 or 6 of this Satipatthana course, the Burmese ambassador calls Goenkaji and says, we would like to invite you back to Burma as a state guest. You can understand how Goenkaji was in a complete whirl. All the travel arrangements were changed. He said, well, how will I get a visa? The ambassador said, I'll organize that. There was a bit of toing and froing, but it got organized just in time. And so Goenkaji, at the end of his course, gave a beautiful public talk and then went straight for the airport. And here he is with Mataji at Sydney Airport, about to embark for Burma. When he got to Burma, a talk for 300 monks, another talk in northern Burma for 800 monks. He met the Venerable Jyotipala, a very senior monk, who had actually been at that Vedana and Sampajanya seminar in Dhammagiri. And he met Mingun Sayadaw, the top monk in Burma, one of those monks who had actually memorized the entire Tipitaka, very senior. And Goenkaji had a few words. Mingun Sayadaw introduced him to other scholars, professors. Goenkaji was able to explain and convince them that yes, the Buddha always talked about Dhamma. He never talked about Buddhism. As they were scholars, for 2 days they went through all the scriptures, all the texts, came back and said, yes, you're right. And now Goenkaji had an open path to Burma to go whenever he liked. He gave 3 more talks, packed audiences. People were fascinated. A businessman teaching Dhamma and getting such big courses, how could that be? They loved it. Next year, Goenkaji goes again. And this time, not only does he give talks, very well-attended talks, but he gives 2 courses. Now, this is the first time which Goenkaji has conducted a course in his motherland since he left. 200 nuns, all new students, and the enthusiasm was so great that another course was organized immediately. His visa had to be extended. Again, another big course. Again, he comes back, 1992, and this time, again, he's a state guest, and he's awarded this title, Maha Sedamma Jyoti Daja, which roughly means Great Emblem of Radiant Dhamma. Now, this was the highest award which could be offered to a householder in all Burma, and it was the first time it had ever been offered to anybody who was not a resident of Burma. So there was Goenkaji receiving this very high award. Not only that, but a large sum of money is given to him, which he immediately donates for the first center in Burma, which was up and running a year later. In his acceptance speech, Goenkaji quoted a poem by Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, an Indian poet. In a religious procession, the road thinks it is being honored. The chariot on the road thinks it is being worshipped. The religious statue in the chariot takes all honor to itself. And seeing all this, the god laughs. And similarly, Goenkaji said, all these honors are to Dhamma, not to the person. Now, a year or so later, a rather unusual event happened in India. A course for 1,000 students. This was the largest course which Goenkaji would ever give, and it was given in a prison, Tihar prison. And the driving force behind this was a lady called Kiran Bedi. You can see her there on the left. Actually, that photo is of her greeting Goenkaji at Tihar prison. Now, Kiran Bedi was an extraordinary woman. She started off her career as a tennis star. She became All India female champion tennis player. She then became the first woman ever to be inducted into the Indian police service. She became an officer. She is famous for having quelled a riot in Delhi single-handed. All the police were too terrified of the rioters who were wielding swords. Kiran Bedi went right out with only a baton, took them on, and quelled the riot. Later on, they put her in charge of the traffic in Delhi. She became the chief traffic officer. Now, a major issue in Delhi was parking. Indians didn't like parking rules, and they parked wherever they wanted, and this caused chaos. So Kiran Bedi decided she'd start a campaign. Wherever cars were parked illegally, she just towed them away. She became known as Crane Bedi because of the towing. At one time, the Prime Minister was visiting someone and he parked illegally. She towed away his car too. I don't know how he got home. Maybe he took a taxi. So what to do with this Kiran Bedi? They decided to put her in charge of what was one of the largest jails in Asia, Tihar jail. It was outside Delhi, 9,000 inmates. Because of the large number, there were 4 separate jails just to handle them, over several hundred acres of land, and it was a hellhole. Inadequate sanitation, hardly room to breathe, overcrowding, and the guards believed that the way to treat prisoners was to oppress them, to isolate them, to punish them, generally make life such hell for them that they would never come back. And of course they did come back. They came back as bigger and better criminals, having done bigger crimes, and as one official put it, in Tihar they do their PhD in crime. Now Kiran Bedi is put in charge. On the first day, she announces she wants to turn this into an ashram. So she starts inaugurating a whole lot of programs for the prisoners. Prayers, meditation, yoga, literacy classes, law classes for those who wanted to protect their rights, even a green space where they could plant trees. And a big reform she did was there was a complaints box taken round every day, sealed. Only Kiran Bedi had the key. The prisoners could put whatever complaints they liked into it. She made sure that every day she read all the complaints and took action. And very soon the trust started, because the prisoners realized that even if they complained about a guard, they weren't punished, something was done. And Kiran said, "Treat me as your sister, not as the jail superintendent." But even so, she was only touching the surface. She was going around one day with one of her assistant superintendents, talking aloud about the agony she saw all around them. She said, "What can I do? What can I do for these people?" And he said, "Well, madam, I've just taken a Vipassana course. Why don't you try Vipassana?" So she was put in touch with Ram Singh. Coincidentally, she got a letter from a Mr. Mehta at the Home Office about the same time, recommending Vipassana to her, putting her in touch with Ram Singh, one of the senior assistant teachers who'd organized the first jail courses in the 70s. And he said, "Well, the first thing you need to do is put some of these guards on a Vipassana course." So Kiran decided that she would send a group of her angriest, most recalcitrant guards on a course with Ram Singh. They came back gentle, compliant, much less arrogant. And so she thought, well, something's working here. So she invited Ram Singh to come and give a course at Tihar. He gave a course for 100, and it was very successful. It included not only prisoners, but some staff. And then at the end, they jokingly surrounded him and said, "Ram Singh, we're not letting you go, not till you've organized another course." And Ram Singh was nonplussed. How could he organize a course at short notice? How could he get out of the jail? So he calls Goenkaji, and almost immediately 4 more courses are organized in the next year. Those courses happen, and by now it's getting picked up by a national wire service. It's all over the papers, the headlines in all the Indian papers. What's going on at Tihar jail? Even some international papers. But Kiran is more ambitious than that. She said, "Well, I want my entire prison population, 9,000 inmates, all to take a Vipassana course. How can we get this done?" And so she talks to Ram Singh, and she proposes a course for 1,000 students. Let's start with that. Now, Ram Singh remembered a long time ago a prediction by Saiji Ubalkin, Goenkaji's teacher. At the time, Goenkaji had just given a course for 100 students, and that was considered a big deal. And Saiji said, "Oh no, one day Goenkaji will give a course for 1,000. And Ram Singh remembered that. He went to Goenkaji and said, "Well, what about it? There's this invitation." Goenkaji accepted. And so then the race was on to prepare a place where a course for 1,000 could be held inside the jail. They chose a large cleared area in jail number 4. The prisoners themselves built a teacher's residence. They laid pipes, put in plumbing, connected the water, connected the electricity, and suddenly there was a teacher's residence fit for Goenkaji with water and electricity. For accommodation, of course, it was their own cells. And what to do for a hall for 1,000? They decided to erect an enormous tent. And here it is, you can see it top left, with 1,000 prisoners sitting in it. So they rigged this up with lights, power, and here you can see Goenkaji giving Dhamma, and he came along with 13 assistant teachers to help him. Anapana went fine. That night, there was a huge, unseasonal storm. Wild winds, deluge of rain. The tent was wrecked and collapsed. An emergency meeting was held at 3:30 a.m. in the morning by the 13 assistant teachers. Should they continue? Should they not continue? They decided they would, and that somehow they would try and repair the tent. So the next day, They meditated with the prisoners in their cells, and other prisoners, not on the course, got together, took out all the cushions, which were completely soaked, put them out in the sun, which was back again by now, and set to work sewing up the tent, repairing it, re-erecting it, rigging up the lights and the sound systems again. Just about by 7 p.m. in time for the discourse, the tent was ready. And then Goenkaji gives the day one discourse in the tent. And that discourse was recorded by ZTV, a Pan-Asian cable television company, later broadcast widely, and all 10 discourses, all 11 discourses were recorded. And the course went very smoothly thereafter. Here you can see a lovely photo of Goenkaji giving interviews to female students, because at the same time as the 1,000 male student course, there was another course going on at Tihar for 100 female students, and he was looking after them too. On his left is Ram Singh, and to the left again, Kiran Bedi. So that was the Tihar course. On day 11, big happy congregation afterwards, the 1,000 prisoners, the guards, dignitaries from outside, and Kiran Bedi is pleased to announce a new centre in India, Dhamma Tihar. Within the jail, there would be a centre, and within 3 weeks, it was conducting 2 courses a month, and thereafter continuously. So Kiran was getting her dream that with time, the entire prison population could all take Vipassana courses. That prison course was recorded by 2 Israeli filmmakers, Ilona and Ayelet, on a video called Doing Time, Doing Vipassana. It won a major award, was shown on various television networks. Do watch it if you can. It's very inspiring. From Tihar, Goenkaji went straight to a big conference on Vipassana in Delhi. It was entitled The Relevance of Vipassana to the World Today. About 1,000 people attended. Of course, Goenkaji gave the keynote speech. One of the sessions was on Vipassana in prisons. Kiran Bedi chaired that session. And perhaps the highlight for Goenkaji at the end was he was able to present the first 11 volumes of the Tipitaka. That's the words of Buddha. These were the long discourses of Buddha called the Digha Nikaya. He was able to present these first 11 volumes to the Burmese ambassador, very proudly, and he gave him extra copies and said, please give them to the other Asian countries which value India's words. Give them to India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Nepal. And so the words of Buddha were going back into its countries. But still, there was a huge amount of work to do. That was only 11 volumes, and far more work was needed, and it was very slow using the old students. Again, the right person comes at the right time. And you see walking next to Goenkaji there, on the right, is Radhesham Goenka, Goenkaji's cousin brother with whom he was brought up. Radhesham goes to Goenka and says, look, I can get this done. So Goenkaji says, yes, go ahead. So Radhesham hired professional typists, and the system was very simple but very foolproof. Each section would be typed in by 2 separate typists. The work was then compared by the software. Any inconsistencies were ironed out, and then the final draft was checked by scholars to make sure it was correct. And so the final authenticated version was being produced now fast. And Radhesham went to Goenkaji and said, look, the technology's moved on. Now we can get the entire Tipitaka, all these 50,000 pages, onto a CD-ROM. And Goenkaji was thrilled. He said, you mean I can put the Tipitaka in my pocket and carry it around? Radhesham said yes. And so it happened. Now in the 90s, Goenkaji's attention was moving more towards Asia, and particularly the East Asian countries. Of course, many of these countries had long revered the teachings of Buddha, So from that point of view, it was very easy. As Goenkaji said, all that was missing was a practical technique, which was Vipassana. And once they got that, it spread like wildfire. One example was Taiwan. Quite unexpectedly, in 1995, Goenkaji got an invitation to Taiwan from a small group of students. He goes there for 9 days, press conferences, media conferences. He goes to a prison there and gives a talk at the prison. He's very impressed with this prison outside Taipei. 400 prisoners attended the talk. They're there on drug offenses, but he's impressed by the hygiene standards, by the compassion shown by the guards, and the fact that they carried no weapons. And he suggested that there could be a prison course there later. Not only that, but after several days of public talks, meeting with people, land is offered for the first temporary center in Taiwan. Goenkaji accepts it, and a year later, when he goes back to Taiwan for his second visit, something like 20 courses a year are happening at that center. And he gives a prison course in this Taipei prison. This was the first prison course outside India. 1998, you can see he gave a very big tour. He was really busy. Now he was armed with his CD-ROM with the entire Tipitaka on it. And wherever he went, he was proudly able, this was in Thailand, where he was inaugurating the pagoda there at the center. He was able to give the CD-ROM in Thai script to the Thai monks. In Burma, Cambodia, all these places he was able to give out the CD-ROM. Cambodia was a little bit different. There had been courses in Cambodia for some time. Right back in 1992 they'd started, and there was even a center in Cambodia. But the country was war-torn, racked by violence, and had been for a long time. People feared for Goenkaji's safety if he went there, and the meditators there felt very isolated because no one else would come there. Goenkaji was keen to go. Twice his visit was put off for security reasons, and he came amidst a backdrop of major street demonstrations, political protests. They were peaceful, but the fear was that the response to them would not be peaceful. Nevertheless, he came. He arrived one night, September the 3rd. Next day, he presents his CD-ROM. He would like to have presented it to the Sangha, the monks, but they had been almost totally eradicated by the Khmer Rouge. All had been killed. Just a few were left, a few very junior monks recently ordinated. They knew no Pali, and they didn't even have the facility to look at a CD-ROM. A computer was donated, and others were invited to help. There was some scholarship there. Then there were public talks, increasingly large over the next 2 days, ending up with a talk for 700, which was phenomenal numbers for Cambodia at that time. On his last day, the 6th of September, Goenkaji wanted to visit the center, but there was a really rough 2-hour road journey out there. People thought, no, that's not possible, especially as he has to catch a plane that night. So how could it be done? Finally, they hit on an idea. They hired a cruise boat and took him up the river. That way he got to the center. He spent 3 hours there, group sitting, inaugurated a trust, came back, flew out that night, and 20 minutes later, the violence started in Cambodia again. Hong Kong, again, press conferences, public talks, and a monastery offered a site on Lantau Island, which is where the eventual Hong Kong Center is today, where courses could be held. And maybe even more to the point, a year later, the first course was held in Beijing in mainland China, that land of such a huge population and such major potential for Dhamma. In the picture, you see Goenkaji and Mataji in Taiwan. Next to him is Dananjay, his faithful secretary, very skillful secretary over so many years, and behind Felix Li, who became the teacher for China. Now, if we look at the scene in 1999, Here it is. You can see all the centres that have arisen now in Asia, the centres in Australia, America, Canada, Europe, and of course so many in India. Now, why so many in India? Because some of the old students had decided that it was really important that there should be a Vipassana centre at all the sacred places, the pilgrimage places. Lumbini, where Buddha was born, Bodh Gaya, where he got enlightened, Sarnath, where he gave his first discourse, Kushinagar, where he passed away, Vaishali, another important area for him, and Shravasti, where Anathapindika, you remember, donated his monastery. And land was bought at all these places. And actually the land at Shravasti, where the centre is today, is actually on the land which Anathapindika covered with gold and gave to Buddha, the great Jetavan monastery. And so today, pilgrims can not only go there and feel the wonderful vibrations there, but they can actually take courses and meditate there at those centres. And of course, not only was it centres, courses were starting. We've mentioned China, Latin America, a number of countries were having courses there, and Russia as well. In the mid-90s, there were something like 40,000 students now a year taking courses, maybe half of them in India. By 1999, 60,000 students approximately were taking courses. And 1999 was a very big year for Goenkaji, because also it was the centenary year of Sayagyi's birth, his teacher's birth in 1899. He wanted to erect a great memorial of gratitude to Sayagyi and to Burma. And in his meditations, all these images of pagodas had been coming up. And then a student comes forward, actually the same student who owned ZTV and had recorded Goenkaji's discourses at Tihar. He comes forward and he donates some land at Gorai in North Mumbai. And he says, you can build a pagoda here as a monument. And Goenkaji was thrilled with the area. He said many serious meditators had meditated there in the past. He could feel that, he knew that. It was protected from the urban sprawl of Mumbai on three sides by rivers and mangrove swamps. So he was very happy with it. And so this great pagoda goes up. And a story about some of the meditators from that area. A man named Daruchuri used to meditate there in the time of the Buddha. Very developed, very strong, deep samadhi, a master of the jhanas. But not developed, not enlightened. And he heard that there was a Buddha in the world. He was so thrilled. He ran all the way from this area, Mumbai, to Savatthi, where Buddha was teaching at the time, finds him in the street, recognizes who Buddha is, goes up to him and says, please sir, teach me Dhamma now. And Buddha says, wait, I'm going on my alms round now. I'll come back, I'll take my meal, then of course I'll teach you Dhamma. And Daruchuri seizes Buddha by the knees and he won't let go. And he says, please sir, now. In a few moments, I may die, you may die, or my great faith in you may die. Please sir, now. And Buddha looks, realizes that actually, yes, very soon he is going to die. And he teaches him Dhamma on the spot. Just a few words. Ditte, ditta mattang bhavissati. In seeing, there is only seeing, and so forth. Hearing, there is only hearing. Brought him right back into the reality of the body, the impermanence of it. He spent a few minutes by the side of the road practicing and became an arahant on the spot. He was meant to have been the fastest student of any of Buddha's students. And shortly afterwards, he did pass away. This monument, as you can see, was going to be huge. It was modelled on the great S.N.Goenka pagoda in Burma, in Yangon, but out of respect for Yangon, it was made to be 1 foot shorter than the S.N.Goenka pagoda. But whereas the S.N.Goenka was solid, this was hollow. And inside was a vast dome, 85 meters clear span, twice the clear span of the next largest in the whole world, where 10,000 meditators could meditate. And Goenkaji had that vision that this monument would attract people, they'd learn about Buddha, and also that so many people could meditate here. Of course, it took time to build that pagoda, another number of years, and by that time, the 20th century is rolling into the 21st century. More and more people are getting Dhamma. The prediction which Sayagyi quoted was coming true. Dhamma was spreading very fast. More centers started popping up everywhere. As Goenkaji said, Dhamma will spread. No force in the world can stop it. And as Sayagyi used to say, the time clock of Vipassana has struck. But the 21st century is another subject for another day. Thank you.